You guys hear me?
Can hear you.
Okay. Cecilia. Can hear you.
You
Yeah,
hear
Chris.
to us?
I can hear you. You
There we
guys
go.
hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay.
How are you today?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
Good, thanks.
Andres? How are you?
Hey, Jonathan, nice to see you, man.
Good to see you. Good to see you. How's the new baby?
Good. She just turned 3 months, so
Oh, wow. Time
we're
goes
busy.
fast.
It did. It does. Thank you. Thank you for asking.
She letting you sleep, Andres?
She is. I can't say too much. My wife is breastfeeding, so she's a champ. But we have 2 others at home, so the other 2 are quite enough, for me to take.
Seems like you have multiple jobs right now.
I do. Bit.
Jeremy, are you on this?
I'm right here.
And then how are we just gonna click through, or how are we gonna do this?
When it's your turn, you just tell me what to do.
Okay.
So let's wait maybe for a couple of minutes. Jonathan, we asked before if everybody agreed to record the session, so then we can share for those that are not able to.
Yeah, that's fine with me. I have
Okay.
no problem with that at all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. At the very beginning, I already started the recording just for internal purposes. Then before circulating to whoever external from the project, we will ask again to you.
Cecilia, you think we should start? Seems some of the legacy partners. You did. Leo, Uriel. Hello. Antonio, Beatriz, Paulo. Okay. Let's start as ones in US need to work later, right? The idea is to record the session for those that are not able to join right now. So thank you everyone for joining for this session. And yeah. Sorry? Cecilia?
Yes,
So maybe we should start, right?
sure.
Okay. So thank you everyone for joining for this educational session from the Legacy Project. I think it's a very nice opportunity to share this program that is between the NCI, the NIH, and an opportunity for especially probably Latin American countries for access for patients for clinical trials. So they will share their experience. We have really important speakers that are working in this program. And Cecilia, Monge, and I will be the moderator of this session. So now I will stop sharing my screen, and I prefer them to present themselves. So maybe Cecilia, you, as the legacy partners know me, please introduce yourself.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this morning. It's really a pleasure to be here and a moderator of this panel with three excellent speakers that will share basically their experience on some of the trials we have here at the NCI NIH that may be open for international patients. And then a special thank you to Dr. Wiernik, who has been a collaborator and has kindly referred patients, and then has also continued to treat them both with the surgical team, most of them, and some of them on the systemic chemotherapy part of things with me. I'm a medical oncologist at NCI. I work with the gastrointestinal malignancies branch, and it's an honor to be here this morning. I'll move on to the introductions from Dr. Wiernik and Dr. Hernandez and Dr. Davis.
I can start. My name is Andres Wiernik. I'm a medical oncologist in Costa Rica. First of all, thank you for inviting me to be part of this. I'm very grateful for the opportunity. I was born and raised in Costa Rica. I actually trained in the US and decided to come back to Costa Rica around 2016. And I've been privileged to work with a group of colleagues here in Costa Rica. We have the only comprehensive cancer center in the country that is not only doing clinical work, but also doing clinical trials. And I've been privileged to partner with the NCI and with the gastrointestinal team at the NCI to refer patients, as Cecilia said, and I look forward to sharing my experience later on as well. Thank you.
Jonathan, why don't you go?
Thanks, Andres. Yeah, I'm Jonathan Hernandez. I'm a surgical oncologist and hepatopancreatobiliary surgeon, principal investigator at the NCI, and I run several trials. I work with Andres with several patients. My research nurse, Kathleen, is on the call, and she will talk about how to refer us patients. Jeremy, I'll let you sort of introduce yourself.
Yeah, so I'm Jeremy Davis. I'm a surgical oncologist at the NCI. I work with Jonathan. I'm going to start off today just because I've given this presentation a few times to try to introduce people to the NCI. I've been here for a total of about 10 years, first as a fellow and now as staff, and I mainly study gastric cancer. So I'm going to share my slides, and then you guys let me know if it works properly. Okay, which screen do you see? Do you see the appropriate screen or the?
Yes, we see the appropriate screen.
Okay, so you're good?
It's good.
Okay. So this photo actually is the building where Cecilia and Jonathan and I work, building 10 in Bethesda, Maryland. So I'm going to start off today, though, by talking about what this building is, and really it's called the clinical center because essentially it's a hospital, but people refer to it as America's Research Hospital. It opened in 1953, which is not necessarily that long ago, but it's unique because it's a 200-bed hospital that's essentially surrounded by research labs, and it's the only hospital of its kind dedicated to clinical research. And at any given time, there are about 1,600 clinical research protocols going on in this building. Now, every patient who comes to the NIH is on a research study. So they don't come here for routine things. So for instance, Jonathan and I as surgeons don't get referred patients, let's say, with a problem like, appendicitis, because if there's no research going on here for that problem, we won't see it. The other important thing is that the clinical care that's provided in the context of a clinical trial is provided free of charge to the patient. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. It is an amazing place. I do want to mention that there are a lot of things that were done first here at the NIH in Maryland. First was the cure of a solid tumor with chemotherapy, and that's actually methotrexate for choriocarcinoma. A successful replacement of a mitral valve. This was back in the early 1960s. And then, of course, most recently, description of the pathogenesis of AIDS. I just want to mention where we work, where Jonathan, Cecilia, and I work. It's called the Center for Cancer Research, and it's part of the National Cancer Institute, which really has two parts. The intramural part, which is meaning the part where we work here on campus, and then the extramural part, which most people are familiar with, which is the part of the National Cancer Institute that funds cancer research throughout the United States. So the Center for Cancer Research, you can imagine, is kind of like a large comprehensive cancer center, but it's not one place, but it's the entity. It consists of about 2,900 staff and about 900 postdoctoral or clinical research fellows. And there are actually two campuses, but the primary one is here in Bethesda. There are about 164 principal investigators housed here on our campus. There's a smaller campus about an hour north of here in Frederick, Maryland. If you look at the research portfolio for the National Cancer Institute, or this intramural part of the National Cancer Institute where we work, about 50% of it is clinical translational research, and the other 50% is basic science research. And if you look at the breakdown of research topics, cancer mechanisms by far is the biggest kind of research topic, but obviously tumor immunology, cell signaling, epigenetics, etc. A lot of areas of cancer research are covered here within the intramural part of the NCI. Next, I just want to dive right into the kinds of clinical trials that are going on here in gastrointestinal cancers, at least on the surgery side of things. So in the surgical oncology program, we have clinical research programs that cover, I think, a host of really tough cancers. So the first is liver metastasis, and I think this covers colorectal, neuroendocrine, and probably some others, and Jonathan can answer more questions about that later. We certainly have clinical trials, or Jonathan does, in pancreas and biliary tract cancers. You'll hear from one of our partners, Dr. Blakely, on another day about clinical trials for peritoneal surface malignancies. And this really is appendiceal cancers, colorectal cancers, peritoneal mesothelioma, ovarian, and gastric. And then I told you that I have clinical trials in gastric adenocarcinomas and hereditary diffuse gastric cancer. And then we also see patients with gastrointestinal stromal tumors, both hereditary and sporadic. This covers most of what we see. There may be a few other rare things that I've not included here, but these are the things that we have robust clinical trials in. This is just a list of the active clinical trials. This may not represent things that are in development, obviously, because new clinical trials will come along regularly. And we'll go over these in more detail as people have questions, but I just want to go through each briefly. The first clinical trial up here on the left is Jonathan's clinical trial, a randomized phase 2 study of hepatic artery infusion for patients with unresectable cholangiocarcinoma. Below that is a trial also of hepatic artery infusion pump chemotherapy for patients with metastatic colorectal cancer or intrahepatic cholangiocarcinoma. I mentioned our studies in peritoneal surface malignancies. Here's one of the trials that you'll hear about from Dr. Blakely on another day about HIPEC for the treatment of carcinomatosis, whether it's ovarian, colorectal, appendiceal, or peritoneal mesothelioma. I mentioned that I study mainly gastric cancer, and I study gastric cancer that's both hereditary and sporadic. But for the hereditary clinical trial or hereditary gastric cancer caused by CDH1, I have multiple clinical trials. One of them is a surveillance study for patients who do not want to undergo prophylactic total gastrectomy. And then over here on the bottom right is my study for hereditary gastric cancer syndromes in general, not just CDH1, but could be others. Going backwards, the gastrointestinal stromal tumors. This is both for sporadic and hereditary. Hereditary meaning, wild type GIST caused by SDH germline mutations. And then this is actually a really newer clinical trial here that we're excited about, intravenous and intraperitoneal paclitaxel with oral nilotinib. This covers a lot of peritoneal carcinomatosis, whether it's colorectal, appendiceal, small bowel, gastric, ovarian, or other gynecologic malignancies. We're very excited about this trial that Dr. Blakely is running. And then obviously Dr. Hernandez will talk more to round out his studies of hepatic artery infusion pump chemotherapy for patients with metastatic colorectal cancer. I spoke earlier. This one over here is in a combination with M9241, and he can talk about that more later. But this is kind of our portfolio, clinical trials. Rather than go into the details of each clinical trial, I think what Cecilia and Tania wanted us to do was give you an overview of what it's like to send a patient to the NIH. And Kathleen will be able to answer questions about this later. But basically, we have a few basic things. We need to receive medical records. So that would mean surgical reports or other procedure reports like endoscopies, pathology reports, CT or MRI imaging, and certainly some basic medical or surgical history. And then what happens is they get screened, the patient gets screened for eligibility. This gets performed remotely. We don't have to do that here in person. But then at some point, if the person or the patient looks like they're eligible for a clinical trial, they come to NIH for an evaluation. And usually after that evaluation, we have a multidisciplinary review. So they still get evaluated not just by the surgeons, but there will be input from whether it's gastroenterology, medical oncology, radiation oncology, et cetera, here after they're seen in the clinic. Now, some considerations, and Andres probably knows this from working with his own patients, but just some overview that the patient would have to consider. Number one, application for a B2 visa ahead of coming for treatment. Usually letters of support, but not sponsorship, can be provided. The other thing patients should know is that, again, there's no cost for the care that's provided here at the NIH. We also provide payment for the patient's domestic travel within the United States after the first visit. So basically, after they come for their first evaluation at the NIH, if they are eligible for the clinical trial, anytime they travel back to the United States, once they enter the United States, their travel within the United States is covered. So for instance, if they fly into Miami, then the flight from Miami to Washington, D.C. would be covered. Then we provide any follow-up care that's related to the protocol here, but certainly we'll talk later about standard of care or care at home and how we partner with treating physicians back at home. Another thing to be aware of, because I think patients ask questions about this quite a bit, is that Interpreter services are available here at the NIH 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and certainly also available in person. For instance, when we know a patient's coming to the clinic, we will schedule interpreters. But many of our protocol and procedure consents have already been translated into Spanish and other common languages, and we certainly have some team members that are bilingual. And then other thing to mention is necessary accommodations are provided for patients according to the American with Disabilities Act, and that's really to reduce barriers for patients that are traveling or coming here for treatment. We want to make sure there's equal access for all people regardless of their disabilities. Now, I think the last part that I'll mention, and then I'll hand it over to Jonathan, is that things for the physicians to consider when they're sending a patient here to be considered for one of our trials is that we don't often provide standard therapy. So I'll give you an example. If I see somebody with gastric adenocarcinoma, and maybe they don't have great access to surgical care, but they do have access to medical oncology care, it's oftentimes the case that it's best for that patient to receive their perioperative chemotherapy or neoadjuvant chemotherapy locally, and then they come here for, let's say, surgery. Another example might be somebody with metastatic colon cancer who needs to get standard first-line chemotherapy, such as FOLFOX. They would get that standard of care frontline chemotherapy locally. And then we provide care on a clinical trial, which most of our clinical trials obviously are going to be for investigative drugs or things that aren't available in the community. The other thing to consider is that the NIH cannot provide direct care externally, meaning once the patient leaves the NIH, we can't be responsible for things like rehabilitation, infusions, or wound care. And those are things that have to be coordinated and provided locally. An example of that is patients that may go home with a feeding tube or need other home care. It's really going to be the responsibility of the referring physician when the patient returns home, because we just don't have the ability to provide that outside of the NIH. And so these are important things to consider before referring a patient, or at least during that process. And we can certainly answer more questions at the end of this presentation. But now I want to turn it over to Jonathan to round out some of the discussion, specifically since his clinical trials are a bit more complex than most. So Jonathan, I'll run the slides for you.
Okay. Thanks, Jeremy. I appreciate it. So that was an excellent overview. I think that sort of outlines who we are as an institution and some of the things we're capable of. But I do, this may or may not be something familiar to people. And so I think it's probably worth understanding what it is we're doing with some of these patients who have metastases from colorectal cancer, or they could have an intrahepatic cholangiocarcinoma. This is a therapy envisioned for people whose life-limiting disease is going to be in their liver, and the thought is if we can control that disease, we can certainly make people live longer. And if this is going to be their only site of disease, you could potentially have a very good outcome. And this involves a hepatic artery infusion pump, which is surgically implanted. So what I'm showing you here is the schema of our newest trial, but we also have another trial that does not involve this study drug called M9241, which is an immunocytokine. I'll get to that in a second. The important thing to know is this has to be placed by an operation. A fair amount of dissection has to be done, and this catheter has to go into the gastroduodenal artery. And this hepatic artery infusion pump, which is about the size of a hockey puck, sits underneath the patient's skin. And that patient has to come back to the NIH to be filled. That pump has to be filled every 2 weeks, and it dispenses over 2 weeks. And so these are important considerations when thinking about patients to refer to us. This patient has to get to us every 2 weeks if we're going to put them on a study. I think probably I won't go into terrible specifics about the trial, but I do think it's important to know that this patient has to come back every 2 weeks. So the surgeries the pump's put in, the surgery is undertaken, therapy is started, but every 2 weeks the patient has to return to have their pump filled with chemotherapy or heparin saline. Now, in this particular study, the patient has to get systemic therapy here, but on other studies that I've treated patients with Andres, the patient can get therapy, outside the systemic portions of the therapy. Next slide, Jeremy. I won't go into the specifics about what the study drug is, but it's an immunocytokine that delivers interleukin-12 into the tumor. Go ahead and click this a couple of times. It binds to histone DNA, which is when tumor cells are dying, necrotic. Go ahead and click a couple times. And the thought is we can deliver this immunocytokine to potentially create a hot tumor microenvironment from an otherwise cold tumor microenvironment. No other tricks with metastatic colorectal cancer have really worked to make immunotherapy work, but this is sort of a different way of thinking about it. Next slide. So this is just to show you the study schema about this. So on days 1 through 14, the patient gets, therapy, but the point here is they got to come back every 2 weeks. We'll start the pump chemotherapy, this immunocytokine, and the following month we'll start systemic therapy. And so every 2 weeks they're here, they get hepatic artery infusion pump therapy with fluoxuridine or FUDR. And then the next 2 weeks they get heparin saline in the pump, and they'll get the immunocytokine or systemic therapy, every 2 weeks. There's a lot of immune analyses that were worked into this study, which I won't go into for the interest of time. So several of my trials have these pumps built in. So again, the important thing to know is patients got to come back every 2 weeks. And the patient has to be willing to do that. Okay. I do want to mention one more study before I stop. And that is for biliary tract cancers. And the reason I think this is interesting for everyone to know about is it does include gallbladder cancer, which can be pretty endemic in certain parts of South America. And so this isn't for everybody with biliary tract cancers. I won't go into the background research about this, but there is an immunostain which identifies a marker, which we think patients with this marker are going to be susceptible to this drug. So go ahead and click a couple times, Jeremy. So we don't want patients who don't have our marker, and we will screen this based on unstained slides. It's about a third of patients with gallbladder cancer or cholangiocarcinoma. This is a small molecule inhibitor, so it's just taken orally. It's very well tolerated. And so this is a good option for patients after they failed first-line therapy for biliary tract cancers. What we would suggest is that you send us unstained slides for potential patients. We would evaluate them for this marker. If the marker was not present, I think they're likely not going to respond. I would sort of not encourage them to enroll in the study. However, if the marker is present, we do feel pretty strongly that the patient is going to respond. And so we would offer that patient enrollment in the study. Again, so after first line for gallbladder cholangio, there aren't a lot of good options. Again, this is an oral one. The patient needs to come only once a month to the NIH. And so I think this is a good option for patients, biliary tract cancers, particularly cholangio and gallbladder. I'll stop there, and I think that's probably the end of our slide presentation. We didn't go into a huge amount of specifics. I think we're going to reserve that for questions about specific trials. But I think Andres may want to share his experience next.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jonathan. That was, I'm always amazed by what you guys do there. It's pretty interesting. For those that join late, my name is Andres Wiernik. I'm a medical oncologist based in Costa Rica. I think it's just maybe, what I can reflect on is maybe sharing a bit of the context of how we started working with NIH and why I feel that this relationship has been of tremendous value to us. As you can imagine, Central America is a part of the world where we're unfortunately don't have a lot of resources. Gastric cancer is the third leading cause of cancer in Costa Rica, and actually is the number one when it comes to cancer deaths. We get almost, about 1,000 patients diagnosed with gastric cancer every year, and about 800 people die from gastric cancer on a yearly basis as well. Actually, I was looking at statistics last night before I presented today, and interestingly, we almost see more patients dying from gastric cancer than from prostate and breast cancer together, which I thought it was pretty impressive. One of the challenges that we have is that we I work on the private sector, in the public systems, we have great medical oncologists and great surgeons, but many times patients do not have fast or, quick access to diagnostics or even treatment. Unfortunately, most of our patients with gastric cancer, like in many parts of the world, are diagnosed with very late stage disease. So what we have done in our program is to have an access program. All patients can actually come for a second opinion. That's a local second opinion. You can imagine even in some of the public hospitals, they're not even testing for HER2. Some of the basics that we understand about gastric cancer are not necessarily performed here locally. And as Jonathan and Jeremy shared, we do have a multidisciplinary cancer program. We're actually right now doing tumor boards with another hospital in Nicaragua. We do that every Tuesday night, and sometimes we hear from cases, in Nicaragua, and every time I get the opportunity to think about a clinical trial, that's some of the stuff that we do. We actually have a research institute here locally as well. Having said that, in the last, the research institute is relatively new. It's been around for almost 4 years. And in those 4 years, there's only been one study for gastric cancer that I'm aware of. That's actually in the entire country. And so that's really an example of, a situation where we have access to patients, we don't have access to adequate treatment. So having the possibility of referring patients to the NIH, I think, has been tremendous for us. And every time we can do that, we obviously do. Among the things that I think have been key for us on the logistics side that they were mentioning, I think that, we have a clinical coordinator as well. And I see Kathleen is there, and Kathleen runs the administrative side of the NIH, at least for the GI malignancy team. And therefore, it's been a great partner for us, and we literally, all we have to do is submit the images and the pathology slides and our summaries and reports. Therefore, I think that's really, a very simple process. Obviously, as they mentioned, our patients need to have visa status in order to access to the United States. Thankfully, that's not been a huge issue for us, although now I know there's a lot of delays at the U.S. embassies trying to get U.S. visas. But having said that, that's been a barrier for some patients, but not for all. So, I don't know if there's any specific questions about what we've been doing. Another thing that they mentioned that I think is key, and that's why I actually like the idea of referring patients to the NIH, is that once the patients get there, they receive pretty much all their care they need without any cost for the patient. And obviously, we're in constant communication with the team over there. Therefore, they've been wonderful in sharing not only information. I had the privilege to visit last year and even was able to see where the patients are treated. And when the patients would come back, I always get a summary, with all the reports, everything that was done. They're literally a call away, from me. Therefore, I'm pretty certain about the care that they're receiving and what needs to be done once the patients leave the NCI and come back to Costa Rica for us to take over again.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Wiernik, Dr. Hernandez, and Dr. Davis. I think that was a great overview of exactly what we want to show in this session, which is what's done at NIH and what the possibilities are for referring patients. And I think having Dr. Wiernik on the call, who's referred patients to the institution and we have a relationship with, is of much value. There are other studies outside of the surgical branch that patients may be candidates for as well. Specifically in my group, we have a CAR T study that's for patients with liver cancer in the second line or further. Again, similar to one of Dr. Hernandez's protocol, it is targeted to a GPC3 expression on tumor. So again, we do screen with slides, but just that's something to keep in mind, that there are other studies, although because of many reasons that were already stated, some of the surgical protocols are some of the best ones to collaborate internationally with. So having said that, and having the honor of having heard from the three of you, I would like to open up the floor for any questions and comments. Yes, please go ahead.
there questions in the chat, or if not, I have like practical questions that maybe, for example, if we want to have the list of the current trials ongoing, is there a place in the website that you can really check that these are opportunity for the patients?
I'll put that link in the chat right now, and then you guys can share it. Our website is accessible, although you have to know how to search for it, but Surgical Oncology Program, National Cancer Institute, or NCI, but I'll put the link in the chat right now.
Thank you. Andres, maybe for you, the question is, when you start the screening for these patients, when do you refer them? When, as soon as you have the first visit with them, or you wait, and more or less, how much it takes in weeks or months, all
Yes.
this process?
Thank you. Well, the timing obviously really depends on each patient, right? As you can imagine, right? I mean, if I have a patient that at the beginning, you know, most patients that we see here, we start standard care. That's the reality. I mean, unless we have a situation where they have liver metastases, or in this case, peritoneal carcinomatosis, where we feel, and you know, we have excellent surgeons here, but we've been in some of our tumor boards where, let's say, we recently had a case of a patient from Nicaragua that I tried to refer. I don't know if he ended up there or not at the end, but this was someone who locally in Nicaragua was considered not a surgical candidate. You know, he had a liver metastases. He ended up having an intrahepatic cholangiocarcinoma, if I recall well, and it was felt that he was not a surgical candidate locally. So I literally just, you know, submitted the images to the NCI team, and within 48 hours, you know, Jonathan and his team were able to look at the images and say, well, this is a case we can do. So then after we have that initial contact, that's when you know, our team works with Kathleen in order to start the referral process. All we do is literally connect. We submit all the images. You know, maybe Kathleen can share, you know, how the process works on her side, but there is a link where we can actually upload the images, and we submit all the information to her. And then I believe she connects with the patients directly, and obviously the patients have a lot of questions about traveling and lodging, etc. Therefore, they do that. But I think we've been very efficient to answer your question in getting patients there. Obviously, I try to do that as early as possible. There's been cases where I know the patient, you know, let's say we recently had a patient that was receiving chemotherapy, and we were hoping that the patient was going to get a really good response, but he had peritoneal carcinomatosis. So we refer the patient, you know, to the team so they could consider, you know, HIPEC plus one of the trials that we're doing. So we knew in advance, you know, like 3-4 months in advance, that this patient's goal was to get there. So we started working quite early with the team. So by the time we finished, you know, and, you know, one of the questions, this patient was, I believe, getting FOLFIRI Avastin at that point. So I had to hold the Avastin knowing that the patient was going to go to the NCI and have surgery. So we literally just, you know, communicate on those bases. And the team just said, Andres, please hold it in the last cycle and do a scan before he comes, you know, and then we'll do the scan locally, and then they just see it over there.
Thank you.
I think, Kathleen, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but you do a lot of work that not only I value tremendously, but so do my patients. And I've been told by them that you know, the work that you do, they feel very supported, you know. So I think it might be worth for you to explain a bit of what you do.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, we honestly, we will start the process as early as you'd like, even if it's something that you just want us to start considering a patient for a trial. If we can get images and just start to look at them to see if they might be eligible for something, you know, even if it's not something you're planning on doing right away, we have running lists of patients, and we can stay in touch and sort of follow them through the treatment. And so that at the point that you start to think, yeah, okay, maybe this is, you know, maybe the standard isn't working anymore and we need to start looking at the clinical trials. Honestly, the earlier we can start the process, the easier. But we can definitely, you know, get people in fairly quickly, I think. There is a link to upload any of the images you need, so you can digitally upload CT scans, MRIs, things like that, so that we can start looking at them faster. But we also, can get FedEx images if there's any problems technically with the links. And so if you just contact me, I can send FedEx slips. We also have a referral nurse, Yvonne, now, who can help get records collected too, if you just need any help administratively with that sort of thing. But then, as long as the patient's okay with it, we reach out directly, and I can just start working with the patient and going over specifics of, how they would get here. So it's not really on you, it's more on us to get them out here. But we communicate with you to make sure, you agree that at what point do we kind of start to make that contact and bring them over.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Kathleen. I want to echo what Dr. Wiernik said. I think that, from my experience and from the sidelines, that specifically the patients that I've given systemic chemo to on Dr. Hernandez's protocols, I think you're key in this process, and you do it in an excellent way. And when you say relatively quickly, just so everybody has an idea, Kathleen, of course you need all the information that you mentioned, but once you have the information, let's say that we're looking at a patient that is a protocol candidate, how long does it take, more or less, from the time you have the information to the team, being Dr. Hernandez or Dr. Davis, reviewing it and then actually having a space for the patient? And I know this varies because the patient may not be able to come at that specific date, but what's the time frame there? And I know that you said it's quick, but just so that everybody on the call sort of has an idea.
So I would say from getting images and reviewing everything to see for candidacy, probably about 48 hours, just to get, time to really go through all of the records. And then to actually get the patient here, it depends a lot on what treatment they're on. So for example, the Avastin, if it needs to be held, for 6 to 8 weeks before surgery, there might be that time frame of, okay, we can't bring them until they've been off for a certain amount of time. It has a lot to do with the OR availability, but patients and how fast it's progressing protocol, but 3 weeks, it can be shorter. It really depends on the clinical need of the patient.
Okay. I think personally, I think that 3 weeks is pretty impressive because, for any institution. Thank you for sharing that.
And sorry to interject there, but I believe you guys also do virtual, not necessarily appointments, but sometimes even before the patient travels, you do that. Do you mind explaining how that works? Because I do think that really has helped my patients understand, seeing a face, meeting the team, not only gives them peace of mind, but also they're able to clarify a lot of the questions that they typically ask me. They say, Anders, for how many days am I going to be in the ICU? And obviously, as a medical oncologist, I don't want to have that conversation myself,
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, that is the nice thing, since patients aren't local, and it's hard to bring them out here just to meet the team so that they can sort of, ask those initial questions of what is it like, so they can make that decision if it's something they want to do. We do have telehealths. We do them during our clinic days, so we usually have them once a week. So if we reviewed a patient's records on a Monday, we could see them as early as Thursday virtually. And those meetings are mostly just an initial sort of meet and greet for the patient, so they can meet Dr. Hernandez, Dr. Davis, or Dr. Blakely, hear about what the trial would mean for them and what sort of commitment it would be as far as traveling and treatment. And then they can ask those questions about what does recovery time for surgery look like immediately, and what is the long-term recovery, and just some more specifics before they even make the decision to come out here. So if they decide after that initial meeting it's not feasible for them, that's okay. There's no pressure on them, but I would say the majority of people after the meeting do decide to come out.
The only other thing I would add to that is, I like to do the telehealth. I don't like to obligate people to come here just to sort of I don't want to waste anyone's time. So we'll review scans pretty quickly. We'll do a telehealth pretty quickly. I will go through scans with them so they fully understand the disease and what I'm planning to do. And, and then we'll go through all the questions like Kathleen sort of said. Now you Kathleen, also does a pre-telehealth with them to sort of explain everything. And so they hear things more than once, which I think is very helpful for complicated things. The real thing is we take care of people and we don't let them slip through the cracks. And so I think that's why patients are willing to come across the map to come and see us and be cared for.
Another delay used to be the pathology centralized revision. So how you deal with this?
So we have recently, we used to obligate pathology review here at the NCI with our pathologists. We've gotten away from that just because of the delays. So we started amending protocols such that pathology review was not obligatory.
Okay.
Now, Cecilia and I talked about, we want to see slides to screen people for certain therapies. That would obviously not qualify. We would need that in order to do that. But for stuff like metastatic colorectal cancer or cholangiocarcinoma, we don't need our pathologist to review the slides. And so I think that speeds things up tremendously.
Let's go ahead, Dr. Wiernik.
Sorry, I have another experience that I think it might be helpful for those participating to listen. We have a patient in common that she had metastatic, she's still alive, but she's in complete remission, thanks God, but this is a patient who's very young who was diagnosed with colon cancer, and I refer her because she had, widely metastatic disease in the liver, and after actually receiving a lot of systemic therapy, she went into a trial where she got one of those intrahepatic pumps that Dr. Hernandez was explaining, and she was actually flying back and forth from Costa Rica to Washington, D.C. every 2 weeks to get the pump filled. But at one point, actually, while she was in Costa Rica, she developed a fever and ended up in our hospital, and we had to take care of her. And, that was obviously a bit of a challenge because our staff and, they'd never seen this pump, connected to the liver, And even myself, I had questions regarding whether or not, she could have a CT scan or an MRI. At some point, I think there were questions whether or not she was having cholangitis, So we had to not only, give her antibiotics, but the team was very accessible all the time for us when we had questions about, obviously we had our ICU doctors here taking care of her, and she ended up being discharged eventually and returned to the NCI to look at the pump and make sure that it was still working. And thankfully it did, but I do think that that speaks for the fact that that the team at the NCI has been there for us, even when the patients are back and let's say they're not necessarily in their hands, So I wanted to mention that because I think Dr. Davies explained in his slides that it's true that once the patients are out of the NCI, they have no way to get treated by the NCI locally, but obviously not even here in Costa Rica. But that doesn't mean that the team is not available, whenever we have questions or need their support, And I think that was a great example for us where we felt that, not only they were there really to do the surgery, more importantly, they were there for the patient support all the time.
Thank you, Dr. Wiernik, for sharing that. I think we're about to hit the time limit. So if there aren't any more questions or comments, I would like to thank all the speakers today, and especially all of the audience for joining us this morning. And I would like to turn the table over to Tania.
Thank you very much. And for those that you want to still thinking about questions, we have opportunity on Friday that we will have this panel in Spanish. Thank you so much.
Good day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Have a nice
Bye.
day.
Bye.
Constanza, she raised her hand.
No, I just wanted to say thank you. Sorry. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye, Constanza.